What has happened, everybody? James Hancock here. We're going to take a break from discussing movies today and instead discuss a little gaming, specifically how to achieve a meditative sense of calm through rage, despair, and failure in video games. And if you play a lot of video games, you'll know what I'm talking about, because we're all faced with that question inevitably where, like, am I broken or is the game broken? How much skill do I have? How much time do I have to devote to a particular challenge or problem? And am I just going to freak out and smash my controller or smash my system and give up altogether? Like, who can say? But what I found is that with the best games, no matter how hard they might be, that once you get over the hump, like a game like Dark Souls, I mean, you're going to see you died over and over and over again. But once you get over the hump, it stops being a source of rage and frustration and despair, and once again becomes this strange sense of calm where you're just like, you're so relaxed, even if you're facing a challenge that ordinarily would make you break out in sweats and kind of white knuckle terror and that sort of thing. And once you achieve that state, you can ride that wave for months on end, sometimes years on end. And that's what I'm always looking for, because, like, you know, tough but fair is the best way to describe those gaming experiences. And they typically end up becoming my all-time favorite games. Not always, but like the most rewarding games that you encounter, year after year of playing these games. And I got the idea for this video when I started preparing for the release of Kingdom Come Deliverance II on February 11th of next year. That game's been on my radar for months, but because I can't scratch that itch for a few more months, last week I decided to take the original Kingdom Come Deliverance for a spin, and all I knew going into it was that it was a role-playing game set in medieval Europe with a heavy emphasis on realism, basically none of the sword and sorcery that I typically look for in most of the games that I play. In any case, I bought the game on the PS5, started doing my thing, and I immediately started getting frustrated. I couldn't do anything, or I should say, Henry of Skalitz couldn't do anything. I was useless in combat. I could barely throw a punch. The lockpick mechanic seemed fundamentally broken. Like, everything I tried to do ended in failure, apart from picking flowers around the starting zone, which I was incentivized to do to pick up some early perks. But it wasn't a game. It was more like a simulation, and a rather mundane, dreary one at that. And so, like a lot of people early on, I said, fuck this game, and I turned it off. But then a weird thing happened, because I couldn't stop thinking about the game. I was still pissed, but I took a look online and I saw that there are a lot of other players who had done their fair share of rage quitting with the game, especially early on due to bugs and a combat system that seemed broken. But that was back in 2018. The game's been more or less finessed into finished form since then. So I decided, what the hell, I'll check out a few guides on how to get started. And then I was back off to the races again. And then I was able to get through the intro and the tutorial, and I was finally out in the open world, and I picked up a few quests, whereupon I proceeded to just get beaten down and murdered by every bandit, knight, or drunken thug that I came across. And I was like, what the fuck is going on? I kept exclaiming that over and over and over again, like, what the fuck is going on? And pretty soon I was rage quitting again, and I was having to resist the urge to smash my controller into my face, something I'd done in the past while playing Bloodborne, which resulted in a nice bloody gash on my bald forehead. But years ago when I was playing Dark Souls, I developed this routine where anytime I was feeling like, a lot of rage or getting frustrated, I'd put the controller down, do a few push-ups, and as a result, I ended up getting really good at push-ups. I got kind of shredded there for a bit. So I took a little break from Kingdom Come Deliverance, did a few push-ups, released the nerd rage, and after I managed to cool off, I decided, all right, screw it, let's try the game again, but this time I'll skip fighting people for a while, and I'll just spend some time grinding all the weird random skills that Henry can develop, like drinking and reading. Yes, you can actually level up skills involving getting shit-faced or reading books in the game, but of course, because this is Kingdom Come Deliverance, I couldn't read a word, and I had to travel across like half the kingdom of Bohemia and the Holy Roman Empire before I could find someone to teach me how to read, which meant, once again, either getting my ass kicked or just running in terror from every single person that I met. But quick side note, I should add that some of the quest lines involving getting wasted in taverns are some of the most memorable aspects of the game, but long story short, I finally had a few little skills that I could work on and start grinding away and chipping away at them, and eventually I found this mean old bastard named Sir Bernard who was willing to teach me longsword, mace, etc. And I don't mean he unlocked my skill and I was immediately able to win tournaments. No, he literally taught me just like how to swing a sword, how to dodge an attack, how to block. And after hours upon hours of him just beating the crap out of me with wooden swords and wooden maces, I'd gotten to the point where I still sucked, but it was an acceptable level of suckiness where I could like get around town or do a little exploring without constantly getting arrested or killed every time I looked the wrong direction. And then after a few days of quite literally beating my head against the wall, I finally realized that I was completely, totally obsessed with this game. Like, it's not a game like Elder Scrolls V Skyrim where you like come out of the womb wielding great swords and blasting spells and that sort of thing. What I realized was that this was a completely new gaming experience that I'd never had before, where everything had to be earned. Both the player and the character Henry, they know nothing. Both you and Henry don't know how to do shit. However, once your character Henry levels up just a little bit, and more importantly, once the player levels up a little bit in skill, the game opens up in all these incredible ways. And before I knew it, I was winning tournaments, and then I was no longer running from bandits. I was standing my ground and beating the fuck out of them, and that meditative sense of calm that had been so elusive was now upon me, and all my petty rage and childish behavior was thankfully in the rearview mirror. And I suspect that I'll be playing this game nonstop until the release of Part 2 in February. So for the rest of this video, I'm just going to rip through some highlights from other games where I enjoyed a similar experience. And this is not going to be a comprehensive list of all my favorite games, because there are plenty of games that I love and adore that don't provide that kind of challenge that I just described. Like even Skyrim on max difficulty, I think it was called Legendary difficulty, never gave me that kind of strange bliss. I was obsessed with the game, but I never had to like get over the hump. I was able to just to play it right out of the gate. But also I should say this is not meant to be a comprehensive list, but it's going to be more of like a question to my fellow gamers about what other games out there provide the kind of experience I just described. Like I hear Hollow Knight is one of those games, but the big daddy of them all is one called Fear and Hunger, which I've been kind of slowly building up my courage to play for years after watching this fascinating video called The Cruelest Video Game. Like just that title alone, I was like, what is the cruelest video game? And the video is just absolutely brilliant. It's got millions of views, but Fear and Hunger looks absolutely riveting. But just hearing about the gaming experience, all the different ways that you can solve a problem, it just filled me with this incredible sense of dread. But I think that's a common through line through a lot of brilliant games, is that there's no one single way to solve a problem. There's a variety of ways to solve a problem, or a variety of solutions for solving a quest. That is absolutely something I've experienced in Kingdom Come Deliverance. But once I've gotten Kingdom Come Deliverance out of my system, I just might have to rip off the Band-Aid and take Fear and Hunger for a spin, because it just looks fucking brilliant. But from here on out, throughout the rest of the video, I'm just going to go chronologically and call attention to those games where my initial rage and frustration and misery and despair eventually transformed into what I can only describe as like gaming euphoria or gaming nirvana. And if you're one of those players out there who thinks that all these games I'm describing are easy, well, you can go fuck yourself, because they were hard for me. But first, let's wind the clock all the way back to when I first had this experience, because I had a funny moment yesterday where I was looking up all the challenging games throughout all of gaming history, and my heart kind of skipped a beat, or I had like post-traumatic stress when I saw some of the titles, specifically Ninja Gaiden. Or Ninja Gaiden, as I pronounced it for years back when I was a kid. It was, pre-internet age, but I played that game until my thumbs bled, but sadly, I never found that sense of calm. Like the latter stages of the game were always just pure white-knuckle aggression and terror. And when I watch people today clearing the entire game like in 15 minutes, I'm kind of left dumbstruck or in a state of awe. And when I watch those videos, it reminds me of taking a martial art. And I've dabbled in a couple different martial arts without ever excelling at any of them, where, some people are just doomed to be, a white belt or a yellow belt or a green belt their entire lives. And we just get to admire the black belts and the experts and that sort of thing. I'm totally fine with that. But probably the first time I ever experienced that sense of calm I described earlier in the video, even if I couldn't articulate it at the time, was Metroid from 1986. And Metroid, if you played it on the NES back in the day, oftentimes you would have the slowdown effect, where there's too much going on the screen at once and everything would slow down. And it was usually at a time like when you're fighting the mother brain, when you needed the controller to be as responsive as possible. So your terror and your dread would just be compounded, and it would just become increasingly frustrating. But at a certain point in that game, once you've learned where all the missiles are, and once you've learned where all the different, special weapons and mini bosses and bosses are, you can just play it over and over and over again, and you just go into the zone where you're just totally chill, totally relaxed, and you just get to kill the mother brain over and over and over again. But early on, I would have panic attacks as I was going into that zone, and all this goddamn Metroids are coming after me, and you freeze them, kill them with missiles, etc. But just the sound would give me a little panic attacks. But eventually, now when I hear the sounds, I'm Metroid, and it makes me feel good. But that was just a really weird era in gaming where you couldn't quite figure out, am I unable to proceed in these games because I'm broken, or is the game broken? Games like Silver Surfer. They were fucking broken, and there's a reason why kids were breaking their controllers and having temper tantrums playing them, but I feel like in the modern era is when we see, like, I guess this is when I really started to discover that there are some games out there that are incredibly challenging, but also incredibly rewarding. And that's an experience that I really value, where like a game like will like break you down and destroy you, but if you're patient and you stick with it, the game kind of rebuilds you. As my friend Martin Kessler says, when playing a game like Dark Souls, your player doesn't really level up, you level up. I mean, obviously you get stats and skills and weapons and that sort of thing, but like no matter how much gear you might have, unless you as a player level up, and unless you're patient and willing to put in some hours, you're never going to have that like that rewarding experience as so many fans of the game like to talk about. But the first game I want to discuss from the quote-unquote modern era is Diablo II from 2000. And the reason I describe it as the modern era is that right around then is when I started getting into online gaming, because in the 80s and 90s, everything was like, you know, just like in your living room with your friends, whoever you can invite over, like in college, playing GoldenEye on the N64. Like we weren't online playing. It was just like four guys in a room, ripping bong hits, listening to James Bond soundtracks and blowing each other's heads off. And it was a ton of fun. But in the early 2000s, I really started getting obsessed with Blizzard games like Warcraft 3, which would eventually lead to me playing World of Warcraft. But Diablo 2, that was a hard fucking game. And I was still early enough in the kind of my gaming experiences where I didn't really understand like the idea of like creating a build, and like some builds are more advantageous than others. And because the music was so cool and because the cinematics were so cool, I could I could still play it, but I didn't quite know how to play it correctly until many years later when I started looking up some of these builds like, well, I can't respec. But if somebody who's much better at the game can assure me that if I follow these steps, eventually my paladin will be, basically like a living god, well then that can give me faith to persevere and play the game on higher levels of difficulty and that sort of thing. And that's exactly what happened, where it's like suddenly it's not really a cheat code, but there are gamers out there who just have more knowledge, more skill, more talent, more time. And if you follow those builds, well then it just completely unlocks the game in like unique and surprising ways. And so Diablo 2, holy shit, I still feel like that's one of the best games that Blizzard ever put together in terms of atmosphere and tone and style and also difficulty, because like I would walk into certain rooms to fight a boss and I would just die in seconds. Like there'd be a couple mobs in there, one boss, but it's like there's no way the game's supposed to feel like this or play like this where you just die in seconds. But eventually I did get over the hump. And then once you get to a certain point where you're grinding away and you're trying to get to a certain point with your build, you can just go into the zone with total peace and tranquility and enjoy all the encounters with Mephisto and Diablo, etc. and so forth, all the demons and devils that Blizzard has been hurling at their players ever since they came up with the concept. And speaking of Diablo 2, one of these days I will rip off the Band-Aid and play Diablo 1, which I've never played. But moving right along chronologically, we have Resident Evil 4 from 2005, which I played for months on end on the PS2. And I eventually would kind of circle back on, I think on the Xbox One when a remastered version of it came out many years later. But I like the original PS2 version. I like the way the characters look, and I like all the inappropriate content that's been removed in subsequent versions. There's famous upskirt shots and that sort of thing, but I don't like censorship. Even if a game's quote unquote problematic, offensive, whatever, give me the full, undiluted, uncompromised experience. But also, like I said, I like the way Leon looks in the PS2 versus the kind of cleaned up version. In any case, I had never played a Resident Evil game when I picked up Resident Evil 4. All I knew was that it was popular, and early on in the game I was like, all right, this is kind of cool and kind of moody and atmospheric, and I noticed that it was kind of difficult to move around. I was like, all right, I get they don't want us to feel too in control of the gaming experience because then it won't feel scary. But then there's a skill wall that comes early on in the game, or at least it was a skill wall for me, where you get to this village where the game, up to that point, the game's been throwing one bad guy at a time at you, or little traps on the ground, no big deal. And then suddenly they just throw you into the deep end of the pool where you have to fight this entire fucking village all at once. And I must have died 100 times. I wiped. I just kept wiping over and over and over again. I was like, what the fuck is going on? And there was this fucking psycho with a bag on his head and a chainsaw who kept coming out and chopping me up over and over and over again. And just the cinematics were getting to me, or the cutscenes. It was all just very disturbing.
¡Por allí! ¡No dejes que se escape! Vayan por detrás. Who are these people?
Finally, I went online, looked up some possible solutions, and somebody told me there was a shotgun that could be found somewhere in the village. Went and found the shotgun, and it still took me a few attempts, but once I had that shotgun and I was able to get rid of the guy with the chainsaw, I could more or less take out the rest of the trash, and then that was all it took. And then for like the next like 2 or 3 months, the game just completely, totally took over my life, where I just played it over and over and over again. I'd play it through and keep on my gear and play through on higher difficulty. And I just became completely obsessed with all the economies within the game and like how to create like the healing potions and how to, like monitor and conserve your ammo and which gear should you keep and which gear should you sell, etc. and so forth. But the game was just a goddamn fucking masterpiece. But I was only able to achieve that level of like bliss and euphoria and tranquility after just like, a couple of hours of just pure fucking misery and hell in that goddamn village. And it's like, I can remember the entire game because I played it through so many times, but what I will always remember to my dying day is that fucking village early on in the game. But thank God I didn't give up, because it became one of my all-time favorite survival horror action experiences that I've ever played. Now, the year before Resident Evil 4 came out, World of Warcraft landed on the scene, but I didn't get into World of Warcraft till a few years later. I was in business school and I was watching South Park, and I got to that episode, Make Love, Not Warcraft, and I watched it over and over again. I just laughed my goddamn ass off. I still think it's one of the best episodes of TV that I've ever seen.
All right, major stone shield potions should be... Oh God, I'm gonna have diarrhea again. You can't go to the bathroom, you're stacking Sunder armor.
I was like, you know what, I'm gonna buy World of Warcraft and see what it's all about. And at that point, the Burning Crusade DLC had just come out, and I didn't quite even know like what is an MMO or how do you play an MMO. I basically thought it was like a normal role-playing game where you pick up quests and grind away, and you slowly but surely get better. But like, I didn't understand the battleground system. I didn't understand the dungeons. I sure as shit didn't understand the raid system. And then I ended up like, getting tired of the game or kind of like forgetting about it. And then when Wrath of the Lich King came out, I was like, I'm going to try World of Warcraft and try to do it right this time. And over the first couple of months of the release of that expansion, I started joining guilds and getting into that and like getting to know the people. And they started asking me like, oh, we're going to go run Naxxramas. Like, we need a tank. Are you going to come with us? Like, what's Naxxramas? Like, what's a raid? What are you even talking about? I was totally unfamiliar with the entire like format of like when you get 10 people or 25 people or 40 people together, and like everybody has like their roles, like support and DPS and range DPS and tanks. Like, I was new to all of it, and it took me a couple months to kind of figure out like how to do it and how to not like stand in fire when fighting a boss and that sort of thing. And then a few months later, The Secrets of Ulduar patch 3.1 came out, and that's when my whole world changed when it came to my understanding of MMORPGs. And Ulduar was just an absolute ballbuster of a raid at that time, and it was basically my introduction to raid mechanics and how like an MMORPG gets run, and like the organization required to try to get either 10 or 25 players, together a couple times a week for hours to go in and fight these goddamn bosses. And some of these bosses, like, you might fight them 50, 60, 70 times before you finally get them down and get like 1 or 2 pieces of gear that makes your group just a little bit stronger, so you can go in the next week and get a little bit further. And at the end of that raid is this Lovecraftian elder god named Yogg-Saron, who's slowly waking up. And it was such a complicated strategy. It was a real eye-opener that, like, if you want to play certain games at the highest level, it's as complex and demanding and requires as much like managerial expertise as like a part-time job, which had never occurred to me. And I remember at that time, like, if you were applying to certain guilds or applying to certain raid groups, you actually had to have like an interview, like, oh, well, send us a screenshot of your user interface and like what add-ons are you using. I mean, it was just crazy. Like, you had to like list your skills and like, oh, I'm proficient with these and I have these alts and blah, blah, blah. But I had no idea that gaming could be so demanding and so complex, and it was incredibly satisfying. And if you were good enough or lucky enough to kill Yogg-Saron, well, then you could unlock a secret boss named Algalon, who you could fight for like an hour. But like the world first for killing Yogg-Saron and Algalon was on our server, Ysandra, Kriparian, who was this kind of a celebrity gamer at that time, who eventually became this giant YouTube channel devoted to Hearthstone and Diablo and that sort of thing. He was on our server, so we were all kind of like following his exploits and his guild's exploit at that time. I can't even remember what the name of his guild was, but in any case, it was an incredibly exciting time to be a gamer. But those early experiences in Ulduar were incredibly frustrating, but also incredibly rewarding, because as much as it sucks having people like yell at you when you screw up and like cause a wipe, and then everybody's got to go back and reset and start over, it's like you don't want to waste an hour of everybody's time due to some stupid mistake like standing in the wrong place at the wrong time. But it was incredibly rewarding. When you finally get a boss down, there's nothing quite like hearing that sound in Ventrilo or whatever software you're using to communicate. When you hear everybody's going like, just screaming and losing their minds because it's been so hard and so frustrating, and you get like one or two like key pieces of gear which makes your whole group just a little bit better, but like all the drama, all the insanity, I've never been able to find that experience again because I've never been willing to get that invested in a giant game again for like a long period of time. The closest I've come is when I kill a really tough boss in a From Software game, but once again, that's a solitary experience. You don't get any of that camaraderie. You just get the satisfaction of killing a tough boss. But I stuck with World of Warcraft off and on up through 2014, sometimes joining different guilds, sometimes joining different raid groups, and some of them would stick around for a couple months, some of them would last longer. But in the game, you could type /played, and it would tell you exactly how many days you'd invested in the game. And it got to a certain point, and I was like, ooh, I'm no longer comfortable with the number of days that I have invested in this game. So I'm moving on with my life to fresh frontiers and that sort of thing. And I won't say what what that number was, but World of Warcraft was definitely one of the most frustrating and melodramatic and challenging but ultimately rewarding experiences that I've ever had in all my many decades of gaming. But let's move on to the next big game on my list, and that would be Super Meat Boy from 2010. Now, I became aware of Super Meat Boy due to this fascinating documentary called Indie Game the Movie, which traces the development of a couple different games, one of which is Super Meat Boy. And so just for shits and giggles one year over Christmas, I was hanging out with all my younger siblings, and I have a lot of younger siblings that are like 26 years my junior, 29 years my junior. Both my parents got remarried, so I've got a lot of younger siblings. But we decided just to download Super Meat Boy, and we basically spent the entire holiday season beating our head against the wall playing this incredibly challenging game. But we came up with this system where a group of us would sit in a room playing Super Meat Boy, and anytime you died, you had to pass the controller to the next person, give them a chance. And it was the first time since my days of playing GoldenEye in the late 90s that I'd felt that sense of camaraderie with like other gamers in the room, like not networked games online like in World of Warcraft, but just like hanging out and just like screaming and high-fiving. And the game is hard as fucking balls. Like, I mean, it's got like secret levels and unlockable characters and all this stuff. And the first few levels are, more or less kind of manageable. But it looks so simple. But what it reminded me of quite a bit is some of the games from the early 1980s, like those classic meat grinders like, Donkey Kong and things like that. And I strongly recommend people also check out the documentary King of Kong, which is a great documentary about just how challenging it is to excel at some of those early 80s arcade games. But with Super Meat Boy, I can't play it by myself. It's not as satisfying. And also, it's so challenging, and it's like, beat your thumbs to death, that unless you're there, like sharing the misery of the experience with other players, it's just not worth it. But I had so much goddamn fun just bonding with my siblings playing Super Meat Boy. And when you finally do manage to get through a particularly challenging level, like the sense of relief and euphoria is palpable. So definitely take it for a spin, but just do it with some friends. Otherwise, it might be a kind of a soul-sucking experience. But let's move on to another game which came out the same year, Civilization V in 2010, which also had an expansion, Gods and Kings, in 2012, I believe. But I played this game so goddamn much that, and this is going to be humiliating even to admit it, but I had such eye strain from like staring at the screen for so long, and I was like, frying and cooking my retinas and that sort of thing. My left eye just turned completely bloodshot. Like, I was always having to like force myself to blink. I eventually took a shirt and tied it around my head at an angle like I was a goddamn pirate who had his eye put out in a sword fight just so I could continue playing the game. But if you've gotten to the point where like one eye has ceased to function due to playing a game too much, maybe take a break, maybe go for a walk, maybe take a nap. But I was just so completely obsessed because what I wanted to do, I wanted to clear Civilization V on the highest difficulty setting. Like the regular difficulty settings, it's a really, really fun game, but it's a very manageable game. But at the highest difficulty setting, you can't make any mistakes. Like every choice you make has to be made with the absolute maximum efficiency because the game cheats and all your other rival nations are like advancing at a rate that's higher than you can achieve as a player. So unless you play a perfect strategy, you're fucked. And I just kept failing and failing and failing. And you can always you can see the development of the other nations and when you're falling behind. And I'll never forget that one time where I was going up against India, and I can't remember which nation I had, but I knew they were slightly ahead of me, but if I could take their capital, I would achieve a tipping point. And I remember I just put quite literally putting all my eggs in one basket, and I put everything I got into attacking this one city with no regard for any of the rest of my territories or any of their territory, what they were doing. And I was able to turn that city, and by turning that city, that capital of theirs, it kind of threw their empire into a state of ruin. And it was this perfect tipping point where the rest of the game was so easy and so relaxing. I just had to beat my number one rival. And there's a finite number of territory or amount of territory, and there's a finite number of resources. So if you control like the juiciest spots, well, then nobody can ever play catch up. And so from that point on, I just took out all my frustration from my previous failed attempts, and I just acted like the world's biggest bully, and it was just so goddamn satisfying. And I just sat there almost like, like a totalitarian dictator. And I could have chosen to win a technological victory. I could have chosen to win like a cultural victory. You're able to basically like win by achieving like maximum success in other areas. There are a variety of ways to win in civilization, but I made a point like it had been so challenging to get to that tipping point. I think I'm going to conquer every single city on the entire map until nothing else remains. And I did it. And anyway, I felt like a total, I basically felt like Dr. Doom, but it was an incredibly satisfying experience that I will always remember. But we've arrived at 2011, which means we're going to have to talk a little From Software and Dark Souls. I never played Demon Souls, but Dark Souls was my first From Software experience, and I rage quit the shit out of that. I remember buying it on my Xbox 360 and playing for a couple hours. I was like, this game doesn't even make any sense. How do you progress, or how do you get better? And I always felt like I was falling behind, like I wasn't investing like my points in the right skills, or I wasn't investing my resources in the right gear. I just felt like everything I was doing wrong, and I was like getting worse instead of better. And finally I was like, fuck this game, and I moved on with my life. But then a couple of years went by, Dark Souls 2 had come out, and I was watching an interview with Alex Garland, and he was talking about how when he was making Ex Machina, either right before or right after, he used Dark Souls 1 and 2 as like his favorite source of relaxation, and how he loved all the customization, and just the way he was describing Dark Souls in just glowing terms. I was like, you know what, I think I've misjudged these games. Let me look up a few guides and just how to do it right. I went back, started playing Dark Souls 1 and 2, and I basically spent like the next 5-6 years doing nothing but playing Dark Souls 1, Dark Souls 2, Dark Souls 3, Sekiro Shadows Die Twice, Elden Ring, and I eventually went back and played Bloodborne on the PS5, which I absolutely loved and adored as well. And all these games have certain challenges or certain bosses that will definitely put you to the test your mettle, test your resourcefulness, your knowledge. Quite literally, like you'll hit a skill wall where unless you can overcome that skill wall, it doesn't matter how much you raise your stats, you as the player have to level up or you're doomed to fail. But of all the From Software games that I've played, I still think that Dark Souls 1 from 2011 is the best example of that phenomenon where, like, once you understand the game, then it becomes incredibly relaxing. Like, no matter how many times it took me to get fucking Calamite down, and I don't even know how many times it took me to beat Black Dragon Calamite. It was a lot. Probably more than it should have, or no matter how many times it took me to beat Manus, Father of the Abyss. That fight was just such a ball buster. That was the first fight in Dark Souls where, like, the boss felt really aggressive. Like now when you play a From Software game, like you're accustomed to the bosses being incredibly aggressive and giving you not even like a second to relax or heal or get your stamina back and that sort of thing. But Manus was the first one who really got in my face. But once you get over the hump and once you beat them for the first time, you start looking forward to them, and you start realizing, like, oh, like, well, now I've unlocked the strategy, so I don't need to have dread or fear and anxiety. Like, I'm going to beat the fucking snot out of them, and then you start looking forward to, like, New Game Plus, New Game Plus 2, New Game Plus 3, because you want that, you start craving that challenge. But even if as like the challenge goes up and like you basically start getting one-shotted if you make any mistake, your heart rate remains calm and relaxed because it all just starts to make sense. Like, once again, to quote my friend Martin Kessler, the character levels up, but more importantly, the player has to level up. And once the player levels up, Dark Souls is one of the most relaxing games ever made, even if initially, like your first playthrough, just pure white knuckle terror and frustration and rage and all that stuff. But while we're on the subject of From Software, I might as well jump ahead to Elden Ring, which came out in 2022, and the expansion of the DLC Shadow of the Erdtree came out this year in 2024. And Elden Ring has some challenging bosses, and one that gave me the most stress and the most anxiety. And sadly, I have not yet reached the state where I have peace and tranquility while fighting her, but that would have to be Millennia, Blade of Miquella. I mean, I don't know who invented this character or who came up with this boss fight, but like when I play Elden Ring, when I do a fresh playthrough, I'm in a weird state of anxiety or dread up until the point where she's finally dead. And once she's dead, then I can enjoy the rest of the playthrough. But you can't really fight her until you're like, well over, like, or at least I can't fight her until I'm well over level 100 because it's just not remotely realistic. But I guess that's all a way of saying that, like, I don't regard Elden Ring as being, again, the same as Dark Souls in that it is not as relaxing to play. But obviously I love Elden Ring and I love Shadow of the Erdtree. Shadow of the Erdtree has some absolute ballbuster bosses, but because I've not yet gotten good enough at Shadow of the Erdtree where I feel relaxed while playing it, I don't place it in the same category as some of these other games. But obviously when it comes to challenging games from software, they are the gold standard, and they've spawned so many great imitators, and some of those games are better than others. Like, I enjoyed Mortal Shell quite a bit, and I enjoyed, what the hell is it called? What was it? And I enjoyed Lords of the Fallen. Lords of the Fallen isn't quite as challenging as some of the From Software games, but you still get all like that great kind of evil, diabolical atmosphere and that sort of thing. But if I were given a choice and I was sent to a desert island and they said you can take one game with you that'll allow you just to chill and relax for the rest of your days, I probably would still go with Dark Souls as that game, because I went through such hell to get good at it and learning all the boss fights and that sort of thing. And now, in comparison to some of the bosses in Elden Ring, like, Dark Souls almost seems like a joke. Like, it's amazing that Dark Souls was regarded as being such a huge challenge at that time. And then you compare it to some of the other bosses that came later, like, oh yeah, Dark Souls is nothing. Maybe that's why I find it so relaxing, because I'm not quite good enough for the other From Software games to become relaxing. Although Bloodborne, the only thing that's really stressful about Bloodborne is playing it in the right order. Like, the map of the game is so much more sophisticated and complex, where if you do hit certain milestones, the whole world kind of moves forward or changes, which changes the other zones. So I'm constantly in a nervous wreck trying to figure out what is the proper order in which to play Bloodborne. But Bloodborne and its DLC are fucking awesome. That is an absolute masterpiece. And I'm glad, in a weird way, I'm kind of glad I saved it for many, many years. But I didn't play it until earlier this year when I got my PS5. And yeah, as advertised, Bloodborne fucking rules. But if I'm not careful, this is just going to turn into a From Software love fest. So let's wind the clock back to a different franchise that came out a few years after Dark Souls. And I'm talking about Darkest Dungeon from 2015, which had expansion packs and or DLCs, The Crimson Court in 2017, The Color of Madness in 2018. And Darkest Dungeon is hands down one of my favorite games I've ever played, but I only got to that point after a lot of pain and misery. And how can I describe Darkest Dungeon? It's like, what if H.P. Lovecraft had been a game designer instead of a writer or a novelist? That would be the game Darkest Dungeon became, where basically you had this town or this hub where you can engage in certain activities like curing madness in your characters or healing the wounds in your characters or leveling up the skills of your characters. But your characters are constantly dying and you're constantly recruiting more characters and leveling them up. And slowly but surely you have like this army. And you can send out your army with like 4 people at a time to try to achieve certain goals. And when you go out to achieve these certain goals, your party never comes back completely sane or completely healthy or completely intact. And so it's like the game becomes this incredibly complex like system of like resource management and injury management and insanity management, where you never have a situation where like, oh, these 4 characters are all perfectly healthy and ready to rock. Let's send them to this dungeon to get some levels and some gear and come back and, have a beer and celebrate. You're constantly in this state of like where you just feel miserable and fucked up and ill-equipped to the challenges in front of you. And as you add the DLCs, those challenges just continue to mount. I mean, especially through the goddamn Crimson Court. This fucker named the Fanatic, who will show up and just beat the crap out of you, and he's so goddamn hard. He kicked my ass over and over and over again. Like, it got to the point where like the Fanatic would show up, I would just turn the game off and like hope that like somehow could avoid him. Or also, if you go into the Crimson Court, there's certain like vampiric creatures where they will afflict you with this vampirism, where slowly but surely, like even if the characters aren't being used, like while you're in a dungeon, you come back and you realize like all your players have gotten infected while you're gone. You're like this game it won't even give me a goddamn break. It It takes a long time to get over the hump with Darkest Dungeon, but once you do, it becomes so satisfying and such a great source of pleasure. And that one took me like a good couple of weeks before I finally achieved the state of calm that I'm always hunting for, but I did achieve it. And finally I realized I was just playing a game that is an absolute fucking masterpiece in terms of atmosphere and game design and challenge and so on and so forth. I fucking loved it. I have not tried Darkest Dungeon 2. I have not heard any positive reviews that make it sound like it's like on the level of Darkest Dungeon. Who knows? Maybe they've fixed it with some DLCs or patches since then. But Darkest Dungeon, it remains one of my all-time favorite gaming experiences, and I've never played another game quite like it. And along those lines, let's move on to an equally unique game, but one that's quite different in style and tone. But we're talking about Cuphead from 2017.
Well, Cuphead and his pal Bugman, they like to roll the dice. By chance they came on Devil's Game, and gosh, they paid the price. Paid the price.
And like Cuphead, if judging it from a distance, like, oh, this game looks like this kind of loving, sweet, tender homage to the great animation of the 1930s. And for people who don't know, in the 1930s, animation was enjoying like a true golden age, because every major movie studio had an animation division to create short films to play before their features. So Warner Brothers had incredible animation, Paramount had incredible animation, MGM had incredible animation. And from that period, you've got people like Tex Avery and Chuck Jones and the Fleischer brothers, one goddamn legend after another. Like, you could throw a rock and find one of the greatest animators who ever lived. But what I loved about Cuphead is how they took all that wonderful, beautiful fluidity of that animation from the 1930s, and they imbued it into this game that is just hard as fucking balls to clear. And if you team up, which makes it, in theory, easier, it also makes the game much more challenging because all the bosses start getting more health and that sort of thing. But much like when I played Super Meat Boy with my siblings back in 2011 or 12, whenever we first discovered it, a similar thing happened with Cuphead, where one holiday season got completely dominated by Cuphead, where like anytime somebody died, they'd pass the controller to the next person. And slowly but surely, we got a little bit better at the game. But like the animation is just so goddamn gorgeous. But it was one of those things where it's so frustrating and such a ballbuster of a game to play, and it's so miserable, I can't play it by myself. I refuse to endure the misery of Cuphead unless I have a wingman. However, if you just love animation and you start salivating when you think about like what the Fleischer brothers did with Superman at Paramount back in the early 40s, look at a playthrough of Cuphead and just watch all the boss fights, and you'll just be just like gobsmacked by the creativity and the fluidity and just like the sheer like ingenuity of the game. Cuphead is just a rare special game, and just an incredibly vivid reminder that gaming has so much flexibility and it can go in so many different unique creative directions. And I love movies and I love books, and I feel like every form of artistic expression out there is equally valid and has so many different things it can do. But I feel like sometimes people have a bad habit of thinking, oh, like gaming, it's all like Call of Duty, or it's all like World of Warcraft. And it's like, no, it can be fucking anything. It can be weird, loving homages to 1930s style animation, and that's why Cuphead was so goddamn satisfying. But at the same time, present you with boss fights with such insane levels of difficulty that when you finally get one of those goddamn bosses down, it becomes this incredibly emotional, shared sense of relief and reward as you exchange high fives with your siblings and friends and that sort of thing, and move on to the next ballbuster that'll make you feel that misery all over again. But going chronologically, after Cuphead, we come to Kingdom Come Deliverance, but I feel like I already sang that game's praises enough at the beginning of the video. But Kingdom Come Deliverance, holy shit, it is just so goddamn fun. And as I briefly alluded to, sometimes there's certain like side plots you can do that aren't necessarily challenging, but are also like just so rewarding, and from like a storytelling point of view. Like there's this one story in there where you have to go see a priest for some reason, and the priest says, oh, well, come talk to me at this bar later on tonight, and we'll talk about it then. So I went to the bar to talk about it with the priest, and a bunch of thugs showed up and they wanted to have a brawl with the priest. So we ended up getting in a drunken brawl. Next thing I know, we're in some barn with a bunch of tavern wenches, like buck-ass nude, having this orgy. Then we woke up completely hungover, and the priest is like, oh, I'm too hungover to deliver my sermon today. You're going to have to fill in for me. And suddenly you're up like on the pulpit having to deliver a sermon when you're like hungover and covered in mud and manure. I mean, it's just totally deranged, but that doesn't give you the sense of reward or, once again, meditative calm that I keep coming back to. It really is the combat, and a lot of people still say that the combat is completely broken, but there's a weird, twisted logic to it. And once you learn like certain techniques and you learn how to, dodge the thrusts and counterattack and that sort of thing, it almost becomes like chess. And yeah, I'm still learning the game. And in a weird, twisted, masochistic way, I'm kind of hoping that Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 will find a way to kind of make me unlearn everything that I've already learned about Kingdom Come Deliverance and make me learn it all over again. I'm very curious to see how like Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 will improve upon or finesse or create like the next iteration of the experience they've already created with Kingdom Come Deliverance, because it's the same character, it's the same setting. Like you just continue with more adventures. So to be continued in February with Kingdom Come Deliverance Part 2. And going chronologically, I've already mentioned Elden Ring from 2022 when I was discussing the From Software stuff. But the last game I want to discuss today before I move on, because I'm starting to lose my voice, would be Baldur's Gate 3 from 2023, which is my all-time favorite video game from any era, from any platform. And initially when you play it, it's not necessarily that challenging. Like the only real challenge is just like learning 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons, how they do 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons in a video game form. Basically, how do you do all just like the basic mechanics? But once you master the basics, you're pretty much guaranteed to clear it on normal mode. Like the only real challenge is trying to figure out like who in the game do you not want to screw, because you have the opportunity to basically like screw anything that moves, and it becomes quite a... You can make the game as kinky and open-minded or as chaste and celibate as you want to. Like you're not required to indulge in all the romances, but you can definitely explore a variety of very strange romances with demons and mind flayers and all kinds of crazy shit. I mean, it's a wild game.
My. I can tell you are a special one from a single glance. You have but to ask, and we can grant you a moment of pleasure. Don't be shy.
But that's just one of many things you can do in Baldur's Gate 3. But I think it is the best adaptation of Dungeons & Dragons that we will ever see. It's just absolutely astonishing. But once you clear it on normal mode, well, you can play it on tactician mode. And the bosses get a little more challenging, and you actually have to like really think about what you're doing and think about your builds with your characters and what kind of party makeup do you want to have. Cleared on tactician mode, then you unlock honor mode. And honor mode is basically a little bit like playing hardcore in like the Diablo games, where if you die, you're gone, and you can't save the game, you can't cheat it or anything like that. Like you just... And I've tried the game now in honor mode several times, and what happens if you die on honor mode, it'll give you the opportunity to continue with the party at the same level of difficulty, but you don't get the achievement of honor mode, and you still have like the single save file. So what I've done now, I've cleared it on quote unquote on honor mode twice, even though I've died in the attempt. But I just wanted to know like how difficult are the bosses on honor mode? Like, am I capable of beating these bosses on honor mode? Like honor mode difficulty, even if I haven't done it like in like one playthrough, as you're supposed to. And yeah, that final boss fight with the Netherbrain, where like he's quite literally knocking out the floors beneath you. Like the first time I cleared it in honor mode, I was down to one character. I had a monk left who was up there just like beating the crap out of the Netherbrain when I finally cleared it. And it was one of the most satisfying gaming experiences that I've ever had, because it was a pain in the ass to get there. I mean, I had so much goddamn fun getting there, but like there's a max level of 12 in Baldur's Gate 3. Like at a certain point, you can only progress but so far, so then you have to perfect your build and perfect your skills and like what's the right gear with the right characters, because there's a finite amount of gear to go around. You're not limitless in your options, so you really have to figure out like what is the appropriate... And also it's turn-based, so it's like you can only make but so many decisions in a row to achieve a certain desired effect. And only on honor mode or honor mode difficulty do you start to see just how brilliant the game truly is, just how complex the game design is, just how incredibly sophisticated it is, and just how the more you learn about the system, the more rewarding the game becomes. And one of these days, I will clear it like properly on honor mode without dying along the way. But it's a hard goddamn game, especially when like some of those later bosses, like there's an undead dragon who can just nuke the whole party unless you're like, get like your globe of invulnerability up and that sort of thing. But there's some psychos out there that clear the game solo on honor mode. And once again, going back to this idea of like there are levels in games like martial arts. When I see somebody clearing Castlevania in 10 minutes or Ninja Gaiden in 15 minutes, I will never beat those levels. But it's like, for me, it's like watching Michael Jordan dunk a basketball like in circa 1984 or 1985. He's on another level. So are those players. But it's funny how with Baldur's Gate 3, I thought I loved Baldur's Gate 3. I thought it was my favorite game ever until I started playing it on the higher difficulty settings. And then I realized just how much more I absolutely did love it. And I played it so goddamn much that like the muscles in my forearms started to, I don't know if they were atrophying or just getting worn out, but like I had like a 2 or 3 month period where I couldn't even like hold a mouse. So it's like, oh, if I picked up anything, I would feel agonizing pain. I finally realized, all right, I need to play some games that have a controller for a while and just let my forearm heal. And luckily the forearm did eventually heal. But Baldur's Gate 3 is my all-time favorite game. And also it's fun having a game where in the modern era, your favorite example of a particular form of expression is like brand spanking new. Like if someone says, if you want to talk about like what are the best movies ever made, well, all my favorite movies come from like the 30s through like the early 70s and the 20th century. It's like the best the movies have to offer, or it's all in the past. Or literature. I mean, like I do read a lot of contemporary fiction, and I love it and I adore it. But most of my quote unquote like favorite books or like favorite authors come from like 100 years ago and that sort of thing. But with gaming, it's not that hard to find examples like the best game, like the best strategy game, or the best shooter, or the best RPG, or the best puzzle game. Like pick whatever genre you like. Where it's not that hard to find the best example of a particular type of game in the last 3, 4, 5 years. So that's what makes gaming so goddamn exciting. But it is my genuine, sincere hope that the best is yet to come. Really excited for Kingdom Come Deliverance II early next year, and I'm beyond fired up to take a crack at Fear and Hunger at some point. Like I just need to find like a weekend where I'm feeling very masochistic, and I'm like, all right, it's time to abuse myself and give myself some emotional scar tissue and play Fear and Hunger because it just looks so goddamn good. Like I said, check out that video, The Cruelest Video Game, and you'll know what I'm talking about. And don't get me wrong, movies remain my first and only love. I've been playing video games my whole life. I've been watching movies my whole life. I've been reading books my whole life. Movies are really what give me sense of purpose and that sort of thing. But you cannot live on movies alone, and I need books and I need games and I need other forms of expression to kind of change things up. And it's just interesting seeing how like each industry is beset by certain problems that are both external and internal, and the problems that the video game industry is wrestling with are different, but sometimes similar to those of the problems being wrestled with by the movie industry. But I find that if you're getting incredibly frustrated by the movie biz, take a break, play a few games, or watch some sports, whatever the case might be. But like, don't let yourself burn out on the things that you love. But it's kind of a moving target when it comes to video games, because sometimes the most frustrating games that threaten to burn you out might end up becoming the game that becomes the most rewarding and satisfying if you're willing to suffer long enough and devote enough time and energy to solving those problems. So let me know what you think down in the comments below. What are the games that are just pure misery to play initially that ultimately end up becoming your all-time favorite games? Because it doesn't apply to all the games that I love, but these are the games that occupy a very special place in my heart. Like if you'll notice that I didn't mention any Bethesda games over the course of this as like games that I found to be, horribly challenging that ultimately became satisfying. Because Elder Scrolls 3, 4, and 5 and Fallout 3 and 4 and that sort of thing, like they didn't challenge me the same way. I love them. I've invested an enormous amount of time into them, but it's just a different kind of experience that I was trying to explore in this video. So I hope you enjoyed this change of pace. Let me know what you think down in the comments below. I look forward to tackling more games in 2025. But if you enjoyed this video, please consider liking the video, subscribing to the channel, hitting that notification bell, but more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.